Llegaste casi 500 años después. ¿Qué te trajo a nuestro tiempo?
Entramos a un pueblo y de inmediato arrasamos los templos.
Lo he buscado durante 5 años. Yo no me resigno a esperar.
Por mis oídos entran voces que me llaman.
Era periodista y aparte era activista. Por cualquiera de las dos te matan.
Mi hijo tiene 5 años, 4 meses que no se debe. Es una obligación de ellos protegerlo.
Vemos primero la zona, el tipo de suelo. Si
eran muertos. Me hubieran pagado lo que le hicieron a mi niña.
A los 17 años hice un examen para materiales de guerra, para incorporarme al colegio militar. Por dinero se hace lo que sea.
Me pregunto, ¿qué fue de mi riqueza? ¿Dónde quedó mi gloria?
Okay, well, I guess it's time for us to begin our discussion. Rodrigo, first of all, pleasure to see you again.
Okay. Good to see you again, Richard.
Oh, good to see you. First of all, thank you, and also congratulations on the film. It's been really great for me to have the chance to sort of look at it a few times and try and come up with some questions, because, you know, one of the things that fascinates me about it, among the many things, is the fact that it really impresses me with how few Latin American films deal at all with the conquest. There are very few films that are really made about, say, pre-1800 Latin America, whether in Cuba or Brazil or anywhere else. And part of that might be production problems. I mean, you might need Spanish galleons or, you know, armor and things like that. But sometimes I wonder that people don't want to deal with what the inheritance of that was, that the way in which those 3 centuries, really from 1500 to 1800, how they continue to affect Latin America today. So I wonder if you could start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Richard, you hit the nail on the head. Those are very uncomfortable centuries. They're very, very disquieting, I think, because in the 19th century, what Latin America did was to try to form itself as a nation. And often it did it rejecting what happened in those 300 years. And in many cases, you know, when they accepted the indigenous past, they did so in a very kind of totemized, you know, symbolic way. They really did not understand indigenous cultures that remained in the 19th century. They wanted everything to be, you know, like about progress and nation building, and this idea of like civilization, you know, sweeps through that whole analysis. So those 300 years are really, really difficult to look at. You know, they're very, they bring up shadows and they bring up ghosts like this Conquistador, you know, and in many ways, I think they reflect how little certain things have changed in Latin America, how little, especially, you know, as you start looking at society and the way it's structured, it's uncomfortably similar in many ways to what was happening during the colonial era. And there's also this unwillingness to accept that anything interesting or positive happened in the colonial era. You know, there's this lack of apprehension, right? But so much of the great knowledge that has survived from the indigenous cultures in Mexico came from priests, for instance. Well, in the 19th century, priests became abhorred by the central government, right? The priests and the crown also negotiated community lands with the indigenous, you know, like communities, so that they could have their own kind of like world system, and they had courts that protected their rights. All of that evaporated in this effort to become Mexican, right? And so I feel like pointing, you know, our gaze to that period becomes very uncomfortable. And that was very clear to me from the minute I had this idea. I knew that this would be an uncomfortable stepping on the toes of many ideas that we have as Mexicans. And that's why I felt it was kind of necessary, because it wasn't just provocative, there was actually something real to it. And so, you know, I went into the film knowing that it would be, you know, discomfortable.
want to continue talking about colonialism, but actually one of the things, one of the classes I teach at Columbia is Latin American cinema. And I always point out that unlike, say, the experiences in, say, Asia or Africa, I mean, in India, you could kick out the British. In Algeria, you could kick out the French. Even though, of course, obviously, Latin American former colonies defeated Spain, it's hard to kick out the Conquistador. He's too much part, you know, of Mexico, of all of Latin America. So in a certain way, that makes the colonial or neo-colonial experience, I think, quite different. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's hard to kick out something that you have assumed and incorporated into your practice, right? Like the way that you know, exploitation has continued in you know, specifically in Mexico, for instance, it mirrors the colonial exploitation. Even though, like, on the surface, there's been all these changes, a lot of the rules and the divisions have remained. A lot of the ideology behind it, this idea that some people are expendable and others are not, this idea that some groups deserve to be a part of the national project and others do not. And it shifts across Latin America, but I feel like in Mexico, we have developed this tremendous pride in our past that avoids, you know, and kind of like bulldozes through all the discomfort, right? And we're all Aztecs somehow. You know, even though there was over 100 languages being spoken in Mesoamerica, like all of a sudden we're all Aztecs, right? So it becomes this very, you know, this ideology of history that's tied to patriotism in a very deep way. And so very quickly, this idea of the conquistador becomes, you know, almost offensive to say, oh, well, we carry this guy inside. Well, you know, I saw him reflected in this film, in the journey of making this film, and in the lives of these people. You know, of course, he's not walking around anymore in armor, but the film, by bringing him back to life, kind of created this, you know, this confrontation with his ghost, with his lingering presence in Mexico.
You make the point, which I happen to agree with, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, that in many ways, Mexico and Latin America is still under a colonial situation. Would you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think when you look at every like social uprising in Latin America, there's this very deep, like, seated class resentment from people who have not and people who have, right? And that's the motor behind all the revolutions, all the upheavals, all the reactionary, you know, like events, like what just happened, the whiplash that just happened in Bolivia, where Evo Morales, all of a sudden, you know, he reivindicates the struggles of the Bolivian and indigenous communities, but then he himself, you know, adopts the mantle of the perennial dictator, right? And then he gets kicked out by the hardcore right wing and he gets brought back. It's kind of the cycle, because I feel like we have replicated these structures of control. You know, the crown is long gone. We appreciate or not, you know, that period, but we have learned those tools and we have used them in our own context. And I think, you know, every chapter in the film kind of examines that in a poetic way, but there's so much behind it, right? There's so much of how there's structures behind each story and each case that just reflect this idea of a colonized world and a colonized community. So, you know, I see for every 20 years in Latin America, it's like left, right, you know, and it's always moving in the same structure. There's no bigger conception that takes hold of, like, how can we as a diverse, you know, group of people coexist and kind of nurture each other, you know, like it always has to be one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because, you know, I guess we agree a lot on these things. You know, for me, Latin America is really plagued by these boom and bust cycles, and it constantly seems to be in this circle and not going ahead. It just sort of stays right there.
Yeah, I think there's a big weight to, like, this is the way we've done it, and really what's behind it. And I noticed this when I was screening 499 in Mexico this summer. You know, we went on the route of Cortes, on the route of the film, with all the people in the film, and I would see it in the audience, or people would say, "Man, I realize I'm not standing where I think I should be standing in this story. I realize I will never suffer a feminicide. I will never be extorted. I will never ever, all these stories, right? And that's the thing. It's like there's this privilege that people build for themselves, and it cuts across society. It cuts into the arts. It cuts everywhere. And I think part of that is just like the nature of what privilege and comfort can be. Like, it's not my daughter who was murdered. It's not my son who was disappeared. I'm gonna keep the walls up, and in that tiny effort that everybody does in their quotidian context, that's where I think this really lives. Because you can have a leftist president, but it's gonna just shift. The dress is just gonna shift to a different group of people. But if you don't actually attack some of these ideas of how people conceive of themselves as citizens, and one funny thing is that all this talk about society, when I would talk to the characters in the film that I had a chance to revisit, they always pointed out the need for empathy. And at first it sounded a little bit to me naive, as this kind of like, supposedly sophisticated observer. And then I realized, wait a minute, everybody's talking about empathy. The journalists, the mom, the migrants. And I think that's where the hitch is, this idea of how do you create a social communal empathy? How do you create a new narrative that allows us to re-empathize with each other? Because the silence is what really, I think, feeds this cycle.
Well, I mean, the thing that for me really ran through, all the stories, and indeed, it seems to me the strongest link to the idea of colonialism is violence. Violence is something that, even though your film is not violent in the traditional sense, it for me communicates very much an atmosphere of sort of impending violence, that violence is all around you. And I was reminded, going back to sort of just colonial theory or post-colonial theory, of the work of Frantz Fanon, who talks about how violence is the very basis of colonialism. That, you see those beautiful houses on the shore of Algeria and the lovely cafes, that's all violence. That's only there because a tremendous violence was inflicted upon the Algerian people so they could build these beautiful, beachfront restaurants and things like that. So violence really was something that very much struck me in the film. Again, not because you show it, but because it seems to be around everyone.
Yeah, it's not a plastic aesthetic violence, right? Like, and I knew that, because it's different when you're watching, like a great film like Goodfellas or something. You want that aesthetic kind of dance of this like heightened reality that is fake. But with this story, with these people, the violence needed to be more subjective and more, something that you yourself, participate as a viewer, painting these images in your own mind. There's images that are not in the film that are lingering in the film. And I've discovered that early on with other projects, this film I made, Purgatorio, out here actually in Tucson, where I realized if people tell you a story of violence and you're forced to imagine it as a, in this space of reality, it becomes much more impactful. And it really transgresses. And that's exactly why I think the film becomes so uncomfortable, because it's like, wow, this is everywhere, And I've had conversations with people, fellow Mexicans, who say, you can't reduce us to this thing. We're not just this thing. We're not like all the terrible stuff. Well, yes, true. But the film isn't just about that. And it also is about that. It's about violence. It's about this colonial element. And the other thing that Fanon also talked about was, what does the violence do to the colonizer itself or themselves? What does it do to their mind and their worldview? And I think that's a very useful lesson, because right now we are in a very polarized world where people have shut themselves out. And some people want to kind of reinvigorate this relationship with colonial practice, in America itself, right? History has become a battleground. But what does it do? What does it do to be a colonizer to those who practice it? it demoralizes, dehumanizes them as well, you know, and that's also, I think, important to recognize. And all of these things, I think, make the film so disquieting and uncomfortable, because it rings true, you know, in a very weird way. This single actor with a costume, he reflects so many things that are happening and that have been happening in our continent.
One sequence which I really love very much is the sequence where you see the young men, I guess, trying to get to America, to the US, I should say, I'm sorry, jumping on the train or attempting to. I want to ask you two things about that. You have this wonderful statement, which really struck me, which is when the Conquistador says, "They remind me of us." I thought that was remarkable. And then the way you filmed that sequence, I don't think I'm incorrect, you give it a little bit of a slow motion, you know, so that, you know, it's turned into a kind of terrible ballet. You know, there's something very beautiful about the way these guys negotiate, know when to jump and whatever, but at the same time, we understand what that situation is. Please talk about that whole sequence, because I found that one of the most powerful parts of the film.
Yeah, you know, that was a really interesting and tough kind of production, because we had no ability to prepare with the migrants themselves. They're cycling in and out of the shelter. So we literally had to stand there in this patio with Eduardo in costume and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to do this film," and literally explain the thesis of the film so people could have a chance to talk about it, while also recognizing, I know you're tired, I know you're busted. If you don't want to speak to us, that's okay. Like, you know, but if any of you wants to, like, you know, we're here, come forward, we'll talk to you. We don't have to show your face, we'll figure something out. And so we started building a relationship with people, and people slowly started approaching us as we spent the day there. And it became clear to me that, you know, the Conquistador is a villain, and it's very almost easy, you know, in our day and age to really vilify him. But I think if we want to really transform this cycle, we need to understand him. You know, we can't just hate him. And there was a logic to why they came. They came with these aspirational, you know, goals of becoming their own men, like owning property and having titles and having upward, what we would call today upward mobility. You know, they had their own version of the American dream. And so in many ways, they also went through very desperate straits. Many of them died. Many of them got sick. Many of them never went home. And that doesn't excuse anything that they did per se, but I think it was important to humanize the Conquistador, because amongst all those migrants, there's also people who don't have a tragic story. They're leaving for other reasons. They might be leaving for that just basic financial need, or they might have a criminal record and they have no options back home, and they have to keep going, or they've messed up in other ways, you know. And so I wanted to break him, and then also bring us into the you know, as intimately as possible into this incredible struggle that happens every day. I mean, you know, like they hop on the train and they're only going to go for 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers, and then they're going to hop off and they have to risk their life again and again. And in many ways, like, you know, that to me just feels such a timeless sequence, because you have this you know, blind machine just moving forward, you know, this economy that's driving this mass migration, and you have like this incredible you know, effort that people are making for very basic, minimal, you know, progress. So it really touched me, and they, you know, that was filmed after we saw them in the shelter, so we were able to establish a relationship and follow up with them, and you know, rely on the migrants also for guidance and on how to shoot the scene. But I think, like, you know, that's something we should be seeing more of. You know, we should be much more aware of what's actually happening, you know, at the intersections of this road. You know, that the United States is you know, like the target of. You know, so many people are living through this, and part of the problem, I think, is that we do not have an awareness of the true scale and magnitude of the problem. We have a political opinion, which is very different than actually understanding and connecting, with the folks that are risking their lives.
No, it's very powerful what you said. Can you talk a little bit about the process of how you included the people you include in the film? Are they people who were known? You read about them? Did you encounter them? Especially, I mean, the mother, is her name Lorena, who talks about Fatima? I mean, that's, beyond powerful. And I'm just wondering how you encountered many of these remarkable people.
Well, as I was writing this out with my producers and my team, I was thinking, well, how am I going to approach somebody and say, hey, I'm going to interview you, and here comes this conquistador, this costumed, clown to enter into your pain and your, I was very scared quickly because I realized, whoa, I'm asking a lot. And so that led to me really approaching folks with this idea that I'm going to be as transparent as possible. I'm going to explain what I see, how I see their story connected to the other stories that I hope to capture, how I see all that working with the history of colonialism, and have a conversation. Because traditionally, I don't know if we're taught or we just gravitate towards that, but in many films, folks just, they just get what they need from that person. They don't have a full conversation about such a thing, as blasphemous as a thesis, right? For a film, nobody has theses anymore, right? We're not all, films are not made with that mindset, and so I realized, man, if I don't explain this, they're not gonna participate. That's on the one side, but then on the other side, there was a serious security risk because Mexico at the time was going through presidential elections, and there was a ton of violence. It was pretty wild, and a lot of it was happening along the route. So I realized, also from prior experience, the best way to be safe is to tread where others have gone. So I decided to look for stories that had been mediatized either locally or at the state level, and had been around for a while, because I didn't want to walk into a surprise. I didn't want to walk into something where there's no protection or no acknowledgement by the system that this person's case exists, and then you get caught up in it. That tragically has happened a lot. During the shoot, I think was when, or right before, when these 3 students in Guadalajara were disappeared. They were film students, and they were filming somewhere. They didn't realize the location was being used as a safe house, and they were disappeared. And the press covered it around the world. Some big Hollywood Mexican directors got involved. So we were very scared of something like that happening. So we looked for cases that had already, happened and had been covered. That also led to another really interesting advantage, which is that people had time to think about what their case really meant. They weren't just going through the trauma of it just happened. They were now activists. They were mobilized. They were learning. They were pressuring, and they had become wise in a way in that path of being victims, right? So they could talk about their stories in these very sophisticated ways, and they could collaborate with me. And so I discovered that as I went along, that idea, based on a security concern, really developed into a lot of really interesting connections, because people knew what they were talking about, and they had trained other people to search or to fight for their case, etc. And so I would always make this pitch, and I would talk about how a film doesn't change the world, right? Like, a film cannot change the circumstance of someone like Lorena and her daughter Fatima. How am I going to change that circumstance? It's happened. I can bring it to a different place. I can create an expansive conversation. And it took a while, but now that we finally have released the film and they could screen it with their community and their allies, that's exactly what happened. They saw this expansion of their story, and they were all very satisfied with the film in that regard, because it was a very transparent process. There was no surprises.
Did you have any official involvement on the production level or any other?
Official involvement, like from the government?
From the IMCINE, for example.
Yeah, we had IMCINE like for Post, the Mexican Film Institute, and they did support us with some of our security strategies when we were shooting the film. You know, but the real safety, strategy, or the safety tool that we had was Eduardo himself, the actors. We would park somewhere and people would look at us and then, think, who are these people? And then this guy starts putting on this costume and everybody immediately, like, the pressure would dissipate, because he's seen as a funny, anachronistic,
Right.
joke. And people would ask for signatures and autographs and cigarettes.
I'm sure he took a lot of selfies along the way.
Yeah, that was perfect, because we could talk about all these things, but people just thought we were some kind of fun movie.
I'm wondering if you've noticed any difference in reaction to the film from your audiences in Mexico and to say Latinx audiences in the United States, because I know you've shown it widely here in the US as well.
It's a tricky kind of thing to get into, but in Mexico, what I have noticed is that sometimes this idea of like, I must defend my homeland comes out. I've had people ask me, where am I from? What kind of Mexican food do I eat or not? Like ridiculous things like that. But I've also had people say, wow, like this is the world. I don't live in it. I'm protected, or this happened to my cousin, or this happened to my mom. It's been a very complex and expansive, reaction from people. It's been discomforting, I think, for many folks to watch the film, because it's not like you watch it and you can say, oh, well, it's not really that bad. Like the stories are pretty intense, right? And so you end with a very kind of, to me, at the end of the film, there's really no more excuses, right? It's a very kind of urgent, state that you end the film in, where it's like, wow, like this world is unsustainable, right? That's one reaction I've had. I've had people that feel they can't finish the film. They walk out, during certain moments, like the moment with Fatima, where her murder is described. I've had people walk out in Mexico. Not in the U.S. though. In the U.S., what has happened is that I feel like people have been fascinated by the story, but then sometimes there's this creeping doubt that people have, where they sometimes think that there was some sort of trickery going on, like that I somehow tricked the people, that somehow the presence of this conquistador is offensive. And I think that's just because, of our manners in the US, are like, we're so scared of offending anybody, So it's been a really interesting kind of path. In the US also, with the Latinx youth especially, like I feel like the film really speaks to their own efforts to decolonize, their own efforts to change the narratives. And so in that way, I've had many positive and interesting conversations with folks around that, and around, like, because so much of your identity as a Latinx person is caught up with this idea that you were colonized, right? So many people try to go back to indigeneity, but really it's about holding both contradictions, right? Like you are, inheriting this history of colonial violence. So there's so many elements there that we have to somehow reconcile ourselves with. And so that has led to really interesting talks. I remember telling a young lady about how, there was all this toppling of statues, I think last year in the Bay Area where I live, and they toppled Father Kino's statue, I believe, somewhere in San Francisco. But then they
Father Serra, Junipero Serra.
Junipero Serra, yeah. And then they toppled a Quixote as well. And I remember trying to explain this contradiction. It's like, well, we need to keep the Quixote. We need to keep that. That is important, and it doesn't make us participate in colonialism, I think, to keep him. Like
Right.
it's okay, right? And so I think the film like detonates a lot of questions. And then from filmmakers across the board, I get a lot of questions of how we did this, right? Like it feels so immersive that people, people are really trying to figure out how to tell these hybrid narratives. And all I tell them is like, listen, this is the only way I could tell the story. It's not like I was looking for something to fit my hybrid, conceit. This was the way to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. One sequence again that stands out. I mean, really, there's so many. One by one.
Ricky.
Oops. Are we okay?
We should be fine now. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry. No, these things happen in the wonderful world of digital technology. Is the sequence with the enmascarado, the guy who tries to sell guns and whatever, because really just about everyone else you present is the victim of violence, and now we have a perpetrator. And in a way, I wondered because even, I don't know if you saw the film by my former student, Fernando Frias, which was on Netflix not long ago and whatever. Even that film, I had people say, did you have to show a film about Mexico that was all about violence and gangs? And it was like, I think the film's about a lot more than that, but okay. I mean, but I can understand too, perhaps for a community that's tired of seeing that as almost a symbol of that country. Talk about your use of this sequence and this figure, whatever you can say.
Well, I remember years ago, a friend of mine, Eduardo Gonzalez, he made a film called The Devil's Freedom. And in that film, he interviews all these hitmen. And I've never told him this, but I remember walking away loving the film, but then also thinking, man, like there's got to be a lot of these guys who really enjoy what they're doing. Like that's what they sing about. That's what they talk about. There's a culture, good or bad. It's a culture. There's a world view. And I wanted to find a character in the film that was involved, but that was caught up in the ideology of it and didn't have any kind of perspective that comforted us. I didn't want someone to sit there and say, oh, I'm so sorry, I've done all these things. I wanted someone to say, this is what it feels like. And it's like, it's a huge high and I'm really into it, and then slowly, ask them questions about the greater meaning of that stuff. And so we met this person in a very roundabout way, because of all the security concerns. And we interviewed him outside of, their operational territory, so to speak, so that we wouldn't like have a risk of like, oh, the interview went wrong and, my friends are coming to talk to you about it. So, we met in neutral ground and right away, like all the connections that I expected started to detonate, because we had talked to him on the phone, but it was hard to impress upon him really what the film was about. He was always like this, like always really sped up, and Eduardo was ready for it, and he just kind of like vibed with the guy and started like eliciting this kind of very confessional conversation where the guy basically says, I have like severe PTSD, I'm addicted to violence, and I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. And in so many ways, he mirrors the Conquistador, right? Because he himself was a military guy, right? Like the Conquistador.
Yeah, no, his story is remarkable, and he keeps saying, "I'm from a good family." That's the other thing that's amazing.
Yeah, he's not some guy from the hood. He's a guy who likes it, and I think that's the thing. It's like until we recognize that some people really latch onto this violence, and it becomes a culture and a way of life. And what that actually means, instead of saying, oh, people have no values. Well, this guy did have values. What happened to them? What are we doing when we build an economy of violence, right? Like when we make it so exciting and accessible to be violent, And so it was a fascinating interview. And then the scene where they start talking about the guns, that was all like, Eduardo just started asking him like in between texts, he's like, hey, what's up with these things? Can you explain these to me? And he built kind of a scene very subtly with him. And then the guy was like, well, here you go. And it's a funny moment, right? It's hilarious, but it's so hilarious because it's deeply true, you know?
Yeah. No, it reminds me, I mean, just by accident, there's a wonderful scene in Taxi Driver where Robert De Niro goes to this guy's hotel room. And again, the way he describes everything is so sensual, you know? I mean, Curtis feels great. I mean, you know, you can see almost the kind of rush that somebody gets from, you know, just manipulating those things. My last question, because I know there are lots of other questions that are coming up. Among the many charges one could make about your film, it's really kind of beautiful. You shot it beautifully, you and your cinematographer. You made a very interesting choice to do it in widescreen. We never see films like this in widescreen. Talk a little bit about that, because there is a plastic beauty that you bring to the film, which I guess for me sometimes competes with what we're watching on screen, but in an interesting way.
Yeah, you know, I'll start backwards. So when I invited Alejandro, who's a Mexican cinematographer but based in New York, when I invited him to do the film, he was very keen on it. But he said, you know, we have to do something really bold. We have to, you know, if you want me to work on this film in these like bootstrap conditions, you got to let me try something else. You know, I'm tired of seeing these documentaries that look like news. And so what he came up with was this idea of the anamorphic gaze, you know, to kind of use these older lenses that are a little bit tattered, but they bring together reality and fiction. And as soon as he said that, you know, I became very scared because I didn't trust myself to be able to work in that space and compose slowly and all that, and all the little things that you have to do to get those lenses to look right. And then the more he insisted, I realized, wait a minute, this is a gift, because essentially, this is the Hollywood gaze. This is the way we've looked at history, right? This is Ben-Hur, Gladiator, you name it, Lawrence of Arabia, right? And it's out in the streets now, and it's looking at the epic journey of real life. So I became enamored with it, and then once we started shooting, I got the hang of it, you know. And on the other side, the beauty side, you know, people have asked me that, why is it so beautiful? Almost sometimes like some people charge it, you know, they're like charging me, why did you make this so beautiful? But to me, I feel like these people open up their lives to me. You know, cinema is an art form, and it should reflect them with all its power, all its beauty, right? They deserve that beauty. They don't deserve, you know, some shoddy camera work. They deserve the best that I can do. And I think when a film is beautiful, it also seeps really deeply into our subconscious. You know, when you look at the films of Buñuel, you know, he would have these very violent movies, and they were beautiful. You know, his best films are very beautiful, and they seep into you, and they become very suggestive, and they linger. So I wanted to try to aim for that, and I'm very happy with the results, and with the beauty that lies beyond, you know, each scene. And, you know, there's all these moments of beauty of the Mexican landscape, and it seems almost eternal in a way. It's just like they're watching, you know, human beings, you know, like flailing about essentially, you know, but you have this beautiful mountain ranges and these beautiful, you know, landscapes in the film. So I really wanted not to lose sight of that, because I'm tired of seeing films that just treat, you know, reality as a medium to get a message across. And they don't deal with the art of making a film, and cinema, documentary, whatever. It's an art form. There's a beauty to it, and we should take advantage of that.
No, I couldn't agree more. And actually, it reminded me again, just sort of use some references. If you know things like, you know, The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz, he doesn't stop talking about how beautiful Mexico is. He just, I mean, every third page is another, you know, quote about how beautiful this place is. So kind of interesting for that. I think we have some questions, and we'd like to throw it open to everybody. If you have questions for Rodrigo, even for me, but especially for Rodrigo, because he's the person of the hour. So please, let's begin with that.
Yes, if you have any questions, please send them in the chat, or else we'll also take some hands. I have gotten a question through private chat, but I will first open up in case anyone is going to raise their hand or would like to ask a question. So I guess the question that I got in the chat that I'll just share
Yeah.
first is, I guess for both of you, I guess starting with Rodrigo and then bringing in Professor Yu with kind of the perspective on film and the role of representation. I guess Rodrigo is kind of the importance of Indigenous culture and Indigenous presence in this film. So one of the decisions we made for hosting this event was close to Indigenous Peoples Day, which is this week. So I'm wondering what kind of significance that held in the film, or even later on, or what kind of role do you think that bringing in those First People voices has in a film like this, as well as just in cinema in general?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And, you know, I think that for the film, you know, the pending claims and the need for justice in the Indigenous community like lies beneath the entire, you know, film, the entire territory of the film, and all the narratives, you know, connect with that. The inequities and the injustices that people suffer in the film were clearly, you know, 500 years ago suffered, you know, firsthand by the Indigenous communities, whether it was censorship with the loss of, you know, so many Mesoamerican books. They had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books that were lost because they were destroyed or burnt or, you know, gotten rid of in a different way, or they were hid and never found. There was a component of disappearing people. There was a component of disease and the environment. There was all these elements that are reflected today, and they all start with indigeneity. I think the other element in the film and that I really tried to capture is the Conquistador's lack of understanding and sense of awe. You know, his sense of awe and discomfort, but also fascination with the new forms of this land. You know, like he stands there and he watches the voladores, you know, with this ritual that's happening today, that happens in Papantla today, and in Quetzalan, where we were, and it's still there. That's latent, you know. And when he sees that, he's still fascinated, and he doesn't understand. He doesn't know what he's looking at. And I think in many ways the film is asking us just to simply recognize we don't understand. We need to listen just the same way the Conquistador has listened. Because if you look at Latin American history, we've always told the indigenous communities what to do. You know, in Mexico, like in the 19th century, you know, we had all these progressive liberals who just said, no, you guys are just backwards. You guys just need to get educated, and you guys need to learn, you know, all the great advantages of Western science, and leave your superstition behind, with no appreciation for the way they do things, their culture, their worldview. And I think we're still in that place in Mexico, and in many parts of Latin America. And then, you know, we also have one specific moment where the film meets a poet, right? He's a Nahuatl poet, Sixto Cabrera, and he refused to do an interview. He told me, I'm not doing an interview. I want to talk in poetry because my struggle is my poetry. And then we created this very dreamlike sequence in collaboration with him in his community, with his own poetry, and forcing us to enter a different space. You know, that's a scene that, you know, ideally you watch multiple times because you got to figure out what the poet is saying in those moments. There's a lot there that he's packing in with his verses. And so I wanted the film to leave us with this need to know and need to understand, you know, instead of providing us some sort of specific answer. I think there's so much more work to do and so much more stories to be heard in the context of indigeneity in Mexico.
Years ago, I was at actually a film program in Oaxaca where I was, you know, presenting some films, and they showed the film Jaula de Oro, and the young man who was in there, you know, who was sort of the center of the film, didn't speak Spanish. I mean, he really didn't. And there was the first time I ever met a Mexican who, I mean, understood a little bit. He didn't really speak Spanish. He had a translator, and that was really remarkable to me, that there are Mexicans who simply, and again, this idea about modern, he participated fully in the modern world. He was a rock musician. I mean, he was all kinds of things, but he didn't speak Spanish, you know, or at least not well enough that he wanted to converse in it. So.
Thank you both for your responses. That was great. We do have a question from the audience here in the chat. Carly, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or would you like me to do so for you?
I can unmute. Hi. I was interested in what you learned from shooting this film that surprised you.
You know, there's lots of levels to that question. I think as a filmmaker, I learned a ton, you know, in terms of the craft and how do you operate between reality and fiction when you're like on the road and there's no script and, you know, you have like 4 weeks to make a movie. That's one side. But I think the most interesting thing is that I learned that when you intervene in the relationship, right, the relationship of power, and you know you're doing it with a film, and you're creating this figure of power, and he's listening. That act of listening is incredibly transgressive, and it lies beneath everything that we're dealing with today. This idea of who's listening and who's not is behind every struggle across the world. Specifically in Mexico, it's very marked, this division of who gets to speak, who gets to be validated, who gets to be heard, you know? And I realized that once you actually listen to the people who have firsthand experience and who have been impacted by these systems of exploitation, when you listen to Fatima's mom, for instance, you don't need to be a lawyer. You get the whole picture of how the legal system doesn't function for a family and continues to violence them and to devastate them. And you get it from a very deep place of wisdom. And so I've wondered, you know, what would happen if we're able to actually do that at a larger scale, you know? What happens if you actually are able to, you know, like switch these roles of who gets to listen? And I'll tell you guys this thing that's kind of secret that happened with the film is that when I was screening it in Mexico in August, at the very end of our tour, where we were like traveling around the places in the film and everything, we did 2 screenings with Fatima's mom. One was public at the Commission for Human Rights, and it was transmitted on TV, and she had a talk and everything on online TV. And then the other one was private. It was private because the guests were very special. They were people that worked for the Supreme Court of Mexico, including a Supreme Court justice, an active Supreme Court justice. And so we basically created that situation in real life, you know, like she was able to share the film, but also speak with these judges, because there was a lot of them that worked for the Supreme Court or federal levels, all women, and then a female Supreme Court justice. And it was just intense because, you know, she got up and she spoke very clearly and strongly about how she has been abused by the system. And immediately there was this, you know, like sense of being attacked, you know, and we got all these complaints from the judges that they felt they were being, you know, unjustly attacked for, you know, this woman's tragic case and stuff. And so you got to see this very visceral process that I think needs to happen at a national level. And then, you know, weeks after that screening, we were getting more feedback from the judges and the Supreme Court, you know, justice saying, wow, like, you know, the more I think of it, the more I realize I got upset because it made me uncomfortable. I'm not in her position. Who am I to tell her what to say, right? Like, I live in a completely different world, right? And these are, you know, women magistrates who are trying to change this reality. So, you know, that was the thing that I learned the most. It's like power lives at the point of listening. That's where it's at, you know? And I think the film reflects that in a very poetic way, you know, by forcing this anonymous character to be, you know, listening. And he doesn't want to, but that listening really destroys a lot of what he thought was, you know, firm ground that he was standing on.
Are there any updates on any of the cases that you speak about in the film?
Well, as far as, for instance, Fatima's case is now going through the court, and they, you know, magically after we did that screening with the Supreme Court, they got a hearing, you know, and so they're working on their case. I know that the woman who's looking for her son the police officer. She feels very confident and more supported by the current administration, but she's also very exhausted. And then, the very first case of the journalist, his family's also very tired, and they're hoping that the case will be taken up by the International Criminal Court. The poet in the film became a lawyer, and so now he's like a huge leader in his community because he's a bilingual lawyer, English and Spanish, and he's I'm thinking he's going to be doing some really great things for his community, and the shelter in the film has been receiving folks and growing as best as they can, even in spite of COVID. And so it was amazing to see them all again and to visit them and to hear what they were doing, but then to also just let them enjoy the film and enjoy reconnecting with the crew.
Great.
We have a question from Ricardo. Go ahead.
Yes. So mine's actually sort of more of a comment than a question per se. But I wanted to go back to this idea that Professor Peña brought up early in the discussion of just how in Latin America specifically, with this whole discussion around decolonialism and the like, how it is very difficult, I would say, within Latin American culture to just completely rid the culture of a colonial legacy. No, and it's really interesting. For example, this year, I think the Mexican government decided to call the celebrations around the 500th anniversary, they call them Resistencia Indígena or something like this, right? Indigenous resistance. Completely, changing the dialogue on the events that occurred 500 years ago in Mexico. And so I just wanted to kind of ask you, Rodrigo, where you see maybe the film being placed within this dialogue. And did you have any sort of intention to maybe place the film within that particular discussion?
Well, yes, we absolutely wanted the film to screen like in 2021 on the 500th anniversary. That's what we wanted. We wanted that conversation to be, front and center, especially in Mexico. And the tour that we did, the roadshow, ended on the 13th, which is the day that the Aztec capital surrendered. I think it's really interesting because, we have this, I'm very suspicious of any kind of discussion around history from an official kind of position in Mexico, because it always tends to become about validating what you're doing now. It doesn't become a listening process, which is what needs to happen. We don't need to tell Indigenous people what they went through or who they were 500 years ago. Some of them were very happy to be rid of the Aztecs. Why don't we just sit with them today and ask them what they need now? Do they want a train going through their land? Do they have access to equal rights and justice? What do they need? But that's the whole thing. It's like history is always being written for us, right? Like leaders across, and it's not just in Mexico, here in the US as well. Like, we just went through 4 years of critical rewriting of history, more like blotting out, right? And like that has a purpose. It has an effect and it lingers. And we may not be the target audiences for that, but if you start to buy into the story and you realize you start to think you came from that place that they're telling you came from, it changes the whole way that you see things. And I think that's really the goal of renaming celebrations and things like that, because feminicides are still happening. The impunity rate just went up, last week, according to the nonprofit world, like in Mexico. So there's not a substantive change, but history is power, right? So there's this need to constantly rewrite it, and we're not exempt from that. That's going to keep happening, for years to come everywhere. And we're seeing it almost play out in real time, I think.
Amazing. Thank you, Rodrigo and Professor Peña, for your discussion, and thank you everyone for your questions. I'll hand it back over to Professor Peña to continue on this conversation. And if you have a few more questions, feel free to send them in the chat. And in about 10, 15 minutes, we'll come back to our last round of Q&A before we close out. So Professor Peña, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, well, let's see what I can come up with. I'm wondering, in terms of that kind of dialogue that you're talking about, I mean, one of the things about it is, just first of all, the recognition of the multiplicity of voices that Mexico has. A few years ago, I saw quite an interesting film, Mexican film, that was about Black Mexicans, communities of Afro-Mexicans who live on the Caribbean coast and whatever, which again is something that, even for someone who kind of has an interest in Mexico, like I do, was sort of a revelation in terms of their existence, how they react. It was an incredible sequence when they're on a bus and they get stopped and the, soldier says, passport, and they said, "You're Mexican? Sing the Mexican national anthem." I mean, it was kind of sort of amazing, almost the refusal to believe that these people could be Mexican. So, I think this gets into the indigenous question as well, because indeed Mexico is a lot more complex and had incredible heterogeneity in the country. So it'd be interesting to put that all together.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge of our time, is how can we coexist with diversity without, going at each other's throats? How can we learn, with humility, about each other and the spaces we inhabit, right? Like there's so many efforts that I think are pointing in that direction, but it's also a very fraught kind of, moment, I think, to do that. I think people want to hold on to what they know, what is stable, what works, even if it means, the exploitation of their neighbors, I think what I see coming out of Mexico is just a plethora of like amazing films that are just, dealing and representing this diversity of universes. We just need a lot more, we need them to keep being made and to represent all sorts of different things so that it doesn't all align into a single narrative. And I think the challenge for us as viewers and participants of culture is like, how do we coexist with this diversity? How do we allow all these multiple narratives to continue to prosper?
Let me ask again, going back to the film itself. Again, you talked a little bit, some interviews I read about, the idea of wanting to somehow commemorate, if that's the right word, the 500th anniversary with a film that would sort of bring those worlds together. It actually reminded me a little bit of a film from the early 90s called El Bulto, which maybe you've seen, a film by Gabriel Retes, where a journalist who gets knocked out or something in 1968, Tlatelolco, revives in the early 90s and looks at Mexico with those eyes as well. So it's kind of I guess, a narrative that we can think about. But I'm wondering what kind of, if you could, in summary, just say what the project looked like on paper when you told people, because, nowadays, even with documentaries, they want a kind of real description of what you're going to make.
Yeah, well, that was the hard thing. I would tell people, hey, I want to bring this Conquistador into like the real space of, Mexico today and with the victims of violence today, and people would freak out and say that, well, isn't that disrespectful or isn't that offensive? I don't understand why it's offensive. I still don't. And it was, but it was a constant struggle, right? But I think what happens sometimes is that, like, if you don't challenge, there's certain stories that are not going to be told if you don't challenge the language of how you tell them. That's the situation I found myself in, where I was like, well, I can't, how am I going to tell this story? Is it like a historical Discovery Channel Ken Burns ripoff type of movie? Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do something boring, and I don't want to teach anybody. Like, I want to, like, create an experience where people have all these questions that they're navigating. And it was hard because I think in many ways, even though there's like a boom of documentary, there's also like a narrowing down of the form of filmmaking and like simplification. Yeah, it's so simplified. And so the film was actually paid for. The first shoot was paid for like by myself and the producer. We had some money from a grant, and for a different movie, and we used it for this one, and because we knew we had to prove it, you know. And once we proved it, and we came back, and we would show people that scene in the migrant shelter, you know, we would show them that almost that scene the way it is, very close to what it is now, and that really started to trigger things. There was always that doubt of like, oh, are you being disrespectful? I don't understand those questions, because it's not like I tricked the people. The guy is, you know, he's there, you know. But there's always this this false sense of pity that we have for reality. And really what people are saying is like, that makes me really uncomfortable. That juxtaposition is really disturbing. I don't know if I can process that. That's what they're saying. They're not really speaking for the victims who collaborated with us. And so it was a process, but you know, over time, I've become very grateful for these obstacles, because I feel like these obstacles help. They actually help make a better film, because you're constantly thinking, am I doing the right thing? How can I improve? How can I make sure this is working? Of course, if the obstacles turn you away and you don't do it, then they're terrible. But I see them as like a challenge, right? And so we have to prove that we can actually do this. And so we soldiered on, and then by the time we finished the shoot, we were able to get support from Tribeca and Sundance and the Mexican Film Institute, and the film just found its life, you know.
Great. No, it's funny what you said. It's a comment I've been saying lately, that I think, you know, on the one hand, it's wonderful that the platforms will support more documentaries and make them available. But after a while, if you look at them, it's like they've all been through the same ringer. You know, they seem so similar, you know. I mean, they really have such a set format. And, you know, obviously not all films fit into a set format like that. So it's, I think, been a troubling thing about documentary on the platforms in recent times.
Yeah, I think money saturates, you know, and it always tries to follow the easiest path and make it bigger, you know. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, there's the level of sophistication that audiences have today. They're able to read a film like 499. When we were screening it in Mexico, and you know, people were bringing their families, they got the film. There wasn't an understanding gap, you know. Yeah. So I trust that. I trust the fact that people who are in that reality I'm reflecting, they understand the film. If they don't understand it and they think that, you know, they get lost or whatever, then that's a problem, because then that means I went off and did something very selfish with their universe. So, you know, but ultimately the film, I think, had a really interesting path, because it was interrupted, right, by the pandemic. And the pandemic in itself was a reminder of the perils of development and all sorts of things that are connected to colonialism. You know, there's some pandemics involved, and then this year the film just kind of revived, and then it finally did a theatrical, and it went to Mexico and did all these things.
Mm-hmm. Have you had the chance to screen it outside of the U.S.-Mexico nexus, either in Europe or in other parts of Latin America?
Yeah, it's been seen in Amsterdam and like places like Poland and Rio de Janeiro and stuff, but I haven't been able to go. I've only been to screens in the US and in Mexico. And so that part, I think, is a loss. And I think, you know, as you know very well, like, festivals are important because of that presence, you know, that idea of being present and coexisting with a film, and it becomes an event. It isn't just something that you plug in, you know, between the news and your dinner or something, you know, like, it's an event and you have to make an effort to be out there.
Yeah. I was wondering if, you know, like with all films, if there's any material that you shot but you just weren't able to include in the final cut, that maybe someday if a DVD comes out, you can put it in as an extra.
Well, yes. And that goes to the question that someone asked earlier of what I learned. So the film actually would go really far in the shoot. We would go a lot further than what we saw in the finished product. And so there were a lot more scripted scenes. So there were moments where, like, the Conquistador would try to hang himself, for instance. He's like close to the end and he's sick, and he tries to, hang himself. So we filmed it, and then we realized this is too much. This is pulling us too much into the world of fiction, and it's balancing the whole film. We have scenes where he's like talking to a group of folks who live in the streets in Mexico City, and it almost feels like a piece from a Buñuel film where like it's all absurd, and like, you know, they're like hugging him and kissing him, and they accept him, and that's the first time he's been accepted in society. But again, it was way too fictional, right? It was off tone. So there's all these things. We were shooting like, you know, 12, 13 hours a day. So we were like constantly trying and inventing, and somehow in that balance, we found the way. But you know, there's so many things that are never going to be seen, or maybe some will be seen eventually. But there's so many things that we tried, you know, like you know, I would see something, I'd say, okay, there's some kittens there. Let's go have the Conquistador play with the kittens. Or, you know, there's some twins here. Can he hang out with the twins? You know, like different things that we just kept trying. You know, there's different versions of that scene in the opening where he lays claim to the land in the middle of the school. The first time that we did it was on the beach, you know, and we gathered all these beachgoers, and it was great, but there was some other problems with the scene, and it was, you know, there was this effort to constantly try. And I think that was part of the problem in the fundraising, because when you tell a funder, oh, I'm going to go see if this works, that screams, you know, red flag to them. Right. But really, like, you want something new, you want something interesting, you got to let me try something different, you know?
Yeah, I always tell people that, you know, the reason we watch tightrope walkers is because they occasionally fall. If we knew every time they were going to do it, why would we watch them? But the fact that they might fall makes them interesting, you know, and I think that about filmmakers too. Those who don't try anything are much less interesting than those who, you know, basically find something and just stay in that groove. Did you always know that you would end in El Dorado if you know, in the US or whatever? I mean, it's kind of a shocking scene. We see him shaved and in the restaurant and whatever. When did that idea come to you?
And he's in Chinatown next to the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, that idea at first, you know, so that scene is actually, the interior of the restaurant is actually in Mexico City. It's not in the US. It's in Mexico City, because there's a Chinatown in Mexico City and stuff. But as I was screening the film, I realized that I was having this terrible reaction where people in Mexico would laugh at him and say, oh, now he's a Chinaman. So, but they were saying it like, oh, like now he has fallen below Mexican, now he's like a Chinaman. So it was like all this like internalized racism and just this really colonial way of looking at that scene. And I was like, we need to change the context. And so just having those few shots in New York creates a whole nother dimension for the film. And I'm glad that happened, because, you know, obviously you want people to give you honest notes. So they gave me honest notes, and I had an honest reaction. I said, no, I don't want people walking away thinking I'm laughing at the Conquistador and I'm demeaning him by having him work in a Chinese restaurant. You know, there's something bigger going on. He's just, you know, he's become a part of the larger universe of our economy. And so taking him to New York was a perfect, you know, like fit. You know, it's New York is an island. So was Mexico City. You know, it was the center of the world. So is New York. You know, there's all these parallels between the world then and the world now in these two cities. So it worked really well, but I was also able to use the interior shots from Mexico.
No, it goes back to a line that I mentioned to you before when he says, they remind me of us, you know? And so in the end, it was sort of like the perfect way in which he becomes another migrant laborer. And, you know, you said it before, and it's an interesting thing to think about how, you know, we think of globalization as a contemporary phenomenon, but in fact, it's been going on for centuries. I mean, you know, sending these people all over the Americas was a first, in fact, we could say the first truly globalized industry was probably slavery. where in fact you had this huge circuit between Europe, the Americas, and Africa that was set up, that was a cornerstone of a lot of international finance. I mean, all these great universities we have in the US, a lot of them were built on slave money. So interesting to, again, think of how these things relate, that the past is never really past, that way.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Absolutely. And I've often wondered what would happen if I was just gonna say, just supporting what you were saying, is that I've often wondered what would happen if in this 250 years of the American Revolution, we suddenly had George Washington walking around. What would we say to him, and what would we think about, and what would his presence provoke, right? It would be uncomfortable. I think even many of his supporters would not want him back, just because it'd be so politicized, right? But it's true, the past lingers because it reinvents itself.
Well, especially in the case of George Washington, I mean, certain things that, a lot of us are appalled by, the fact that he was a slave owner and whatever, why is that a problem? I mean, I think it wouldn't even enter his head, but that's how powerful those ideologies were. They really transformed people's way of looking at the world.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I think we do have some time for some final questions, if there are some.
Yes, that brings us to our last round for final questions. If you have a question, please send it to me in the chat or raise your hand. I do have one final question if there are no questions, but I'll give a few seconds in case anybody has any. And this is a question that I received that I think is probably a very thought-provoking question, and so I'm hoping to hear from both of your perspectives. If there was just one thing to take from the film, and I'm not saying, I know it's very hard to choose one thing or one theme, I guess from both of your viewpoints, what's the one thing that a viewer, whether they're familiar with the story or not, should be taking from it, and what should they be doing with it?
You went mute at the end, but I think I got the whole gist of the question. What should a viewer take from it?
What should a viewer take from the film, and with what they've taken, what should be the next step, or what should they do with it?
So for me, I think it depends on the viewer, and I think every viewer should ask themselves, where do these ghosts live in their own world? Where are these ghosts in their own universe? Whether you're in Mexico or here in the United States, where are the conquistadores lingering in, and what shadows do they live in? They're here. You just have to be willing to accept that, and you'll start to see them, So I would love people to walk away from the film with that question.
I guess for my part, something that Rodrigo really just summed up beautifully, which is just this idea of the past isn't past, that we like to think, well, that was then, but, we see so many of these things that in a certain way began with formal colonialism, which continue. So we see it in Latin America. I think increasingly we're seeing it in the United States. I mean, I think that, I think partially because in the US, we've had such a hard time coming to grips with our legacy, the legacy of slavery, this legacy of racism and things like that, rather than confront it, we just deny it, or say, oh, that was a long time ago. And of course, it's not a long time ago. It's something, still with us very much. And I think Rodrigo's film, in a masterful, entertaining, and provocative way, really forces us to look at that, to really say, okay, what is past about the past and what's present about the past? And, I think you found a great form for doing it.
Yeah, exactly as you both said, this persistence.
Thank you, Richard.
Discussion. Thank you both, Rodrigo, Richard. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Pleasure. Thanks again for allowing me to, or inviting me for this.
Yes, thank you very much. And to our participants, have a great rest of your night.
Thank you
for joining us.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Rodrigo. Look forward to your work.